Good morning. How y'all doing this morning? Good, good. I'm George Matea. I'm the coordinator for AFACCT, and I would like to welcome you this year to the 30th Annual AFACCT Conference. The topic this year is global learning, reflecting on the past, looking to the future. And we have about 120 presenters and 96 presentations this year. I would like to thank all of the presenters for taking the time to share your research and expertise with the rest of us. Be sure to stop by the registration desk on your way out to pick up your presenter gift and certificate when you take your evaluations in. I would also like to thank all of the AFACCT board members who have dedicated so much time and energy to putting this conference together. If there are any AFACCT board members here, would you please stand up? And I would also like to thank Jason Spiegelman, who is our site coordinator at the Community College of Baltimore County. He's done a tremendous job, amount of work, organizing everything for the college. And of course, I would like to thank the M4CAO group of academic VPs and deans for their financial and moral support. Especially Jack McLaughlin, the interim vice president of instruction for the Community College of Baltimore County, who is our liaison. Finally, I would also like to thank our donors. A complete list of donors may be found in the back of the conference booklet. Today, during lunch, we will be collecting your plastic name badge carriers. We will be collecting your name badges. Winners of the donated items will be posted on the board. We will use your names from these badges to designate the winner for the donated items, and your names will be posted on the board behind the registration desk during the afternoon sessions. So before you leave today, make sure you check your name to see if your name is on the board and claim a prize. For those of you who are new to AFACCT, there are 10 to 12 sessions during each of the session periods. The seating varies from room to room. This is a community college, so consistent with our philosophy, the classrooms are not large. If a session you have chosen is full, please visit a different session. Please refrain from pulling chairs into a crowded room, as this might be a violation of the local fire code. Please do not forget to fill out your evaluations. When you turn in your evaluation at the end of the day, you'll receive the coveted AFACCT mug. This is the 30th anniversary version in AFACCT colors. So don't leave the conference without one. Any session cancellations will be listed behind the registration desk. Water, tea, and coffee will be available. And one note, please, the Maryland STEM group, would you please meet your faculty host in the MASH lobby at the end of the presentation, the keynote speech. Finally, the conference in 2021 will be at Chesapeake College. We are searching for keynote speakers for the next conference, so if you hear of someone that would be of benefit to AFACCT, the AFACCT conference attendees, please let your representative know and we will follow up. Also, if you have any topics for the next conference, let us know. At this time, I'd like to present the host of the 30th Annual AFACCT Conference, Jason Spiegelman, who will introduce the keynote speaker.
Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to CCBC's Catonsville campus. Again, my name is Jason Spiegelman, professor of psychology here on this campus, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for this afternoon. this morning. David Smith, over the last 30 years, has cultivated many skills and worn many different hats: a Fulbright scholar, an educator, trainer, practitioner, and consultant in areas of conflict resolution, peace building, and global affairs. David supports educators, youth, and professional groups in developing institution-wide initiatives and student activities that promote civic conflict and peace-building awareness. He has worked with groups and individuals in need of career coaching, mediation, and conflict engagement assistance. He has worked with over 500 colleges. I don't know, we had that many, throughout the United States, and has given approximately 600 talks on international education, peace building, and conflict resolution. I think I need a nap after hearing that. He has taught at Harvard Community College, Goucher College, Towson University, and Georgetown, as well as Drexel, and the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. He is the author of Peace Jobs, A Student's Guide to Starting a Career Working for Peace, and was the editor of Peace Building in Community College, a teaching resource. David earned his BA in Political Science and Urban Affairs from American University School of Public Affairs, an MS from the George Mason University Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and a JD from the University of Baltimore School of Law. His address this morning is entitled Global Learning, Uncovering Success Stories and Planning a Course for the Future. Ladies and gentlemen, David Smith.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to dedicate this talk to Patricia Ferraris O'Neill. This is the big blue marble. Some of you are familiar with it. It was taken by the last Apollo mission, Apollo 17, on December the 7th, 1972, about 5 o'clock. I think it was 5 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Now I can't remember, but it was Eastern time. And it's very iconic. I think when people first look at it, they think it's actually North America, but it's actually Africa because of the clouding obliteration of it. I'd like us just to take a moment and think about the big blue marble that we're on. This picture was taken 48 years ago. And a lot has changed on our planet in 48 years. When I think about global education and global learning, it's often really important to start with the globe and to see where we are in our perspectives with it. So I'm glad to be back to AFACCT. I actually gave a talk similarly to this in 2011. At the time, I was at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. And at that time, we had been in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We had been in Afghanistan for 10 years, and we had been in Iraq in war for 8 years. And I really just kind of wanted to start and to think about that a little bit, and think about it in terms of our own students and the students that we have. This is a photograph of Army Ranger Corey Remsburg and President Obama. Corey injured very severely. He was an Army Ranger. Actually, President Obama had met him the year before at Normandy. And Corey Remsburg had been part of a ceremony in Normandy honoring the landing at Normandy. Now Obama's visiting him as he's recovering. In those years in Iraq, there have been, the RAND Corporation has estimated we've had 3 million servicemen and women deployed in 5.4 million deployments. 2,500 deaths in Afghanistan, 4,500 deaths in Iraq, and 50,000 men and women wounded. With me, it's even more significant to think that since 2001, there have been 76,000 births in the United States. And so we have a whole generation, the oldest of which is about 19, that have only seen war and have seen this as kind of the normal course of things. This is Corey Remsburg at President Obama's inauguration a year later. Or actually, this is at the State of the Union address, rather, State of the Union address. And you can see he's recovered, right? Or he's recovering, so. Lots of American society has transformed over the course of 17 years. And one institution that's transformed probably considerably, or maybe more than other academic institutions, is a community college. If you go back into 2001, community colleges were serving men and women in the military, but not nearly to the extent that they're doing it today, right? This is from the Maryland Community College page and talks about how community colleges are serving men and women. Many community colleges have particular centers that focus on serving men and women. So community colleges, and I think this is important, really stepped up. Estimated 40% of American veterans will spend time in a community college before or after. And I think that isn't going to change in the near future because you have men and women now who are coming back, spending time dealing with maybe trauma, injuries, and at some point they're going to say, I need to go back to school, and that's where they're going to go back to school. So the work that we have in community colleges continue. So I want to change the focus a little bit because we're going to talk about global learning. So this is a photograph. My wife probably didn't expect to see this because she's in the audience. But so in 2003, I was a associate professor of paralegal studies at Hartford Community College. Anybody here from Hartford Community College? Yay, HCC. And I had been at Hartford for about almost 10 years at that point, and I had kind of come to the conclusion that I wanted to have an international experience and to do something international. And I didn't know anything about international exchange. Hartford really wasn't doing anything much at that time, and I actually knew nothing about the Fulbright program. In the early 2000s, probably starting in the late 1990s, Maryland, through the National Guard, some of you may remember this, developed an exchange program with the Baltic countries. It was the Maryland Baltic Country Exchange Program or something of that nature. And so Maryland, through its National Guard, were sending faculty and citizen groups to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And I don't think that consortium exists anymore, but all Maryland community colleges are part of it, if I remember. And I went on a grant in 2002 to Estonia. Estonia is the first of the 3 Baltic republics. I had to find it on a map because I didn't know where it was. I came back convinced that I wanted to go back and take my family as a Fulbright scholar. So that's myself and my wife, Lena, and our children, Lorenzo and Sonia, in 2003. And this is the first day of the international school that my son was in. So this is the opening day. We're going to talk a little bit about international education and study abroad, and I want to really emphasize some of that because that's important for many of our students, but for me it was seminal. It really changed my life. But it also changed the life of my family. So one of the things to think about is that we think often about global learning and global education. We think about it maybe in terms of how it affects us, not recognizing how it affects other people. This is my family. This was about 3 years ago. Same 4 of us traveling the world. And my son on the left is in the middle of his Peace Corps service in Namibia. This is in the desert in Namibia, Sosafle, in the desert area. We were traveling, and my daughter and my wife, Lena, and myself. And so my son actually going abroad for him as a family when he was 9, and he has mentioned to me the fact that he remembers that experience very uniquely, that he went on to University of Maryland, he did study abroad, he went to Turkey, and then he went on to the Peace Corps. This is my family in Korea. Actually, this is about 4 years ago, I think, maybe longer than that. But my daughter, who's in the center, is actually a Korean adoptee. And my daughter went back at this point with us to find out about her roots. This past semester, she did study abroad in Seoul. And she spent a semester abroad. And even though my daughter was very, very young when we were in Estonia, I'd like to believe there was some connection to that. So international education and global learning takes many different forms. And we're going to talk about it not necessarily in this context, but other contexts. But I do want to recognize people who make that commitment. How many people here in the audience, if you could stand, if you've been or received a Fulbright grant? Okay. So Miriam, Andrew are here because we're having a session. Adar actually is here for a session. Adar is from the Kyrgyz Republic. Thank you, Kyrgyzstan. He's actually looking for partnerships with community colleges. Miriam is from Morocco. Andrew is from the United States. But they're not other community college people that are standing up. And one of the challenges and one of the concerns I've had with study abroad in the Fulbright program in particular is that it's not really understood and known by community college faculty. But we do other things. So anybody here who has been with their students, or maybe themselves have been on a study abroad experience, even if they're going back to college or been with these, if I could ask you to stand up. All right, so we're seeing a few more here who have done that, so that's really important. I know my wife and her colleagues from Montgomery College went to the Dominican Republic, and many of you are taking students. Saima, where is she? Is she here? She's a CCBC student. She must have stepped out. I was talking to her earlier. She is going to London in May through a program at CCBC. And I think that that's wonderful. Anybody here who is a student who is planning on going on a study abroad program in the next year, made plans to do that, stand up? No? Okay. So I know she is, and I know there's a lot of study abroad going on in community colleges. So I want to acknowledge and thank everybody who makes that extra effort to do it. It isn't the only way of accessing global learning, but it's a really important way of doing it. So I want to start off in thinking a little bit about education and then thinking about global learning in the context of that. So Malcolm X, this is from Malcolm X in 1964. He was at the founding forum of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. And I like that, using a word passport in this context, because the passport is this kind of sacred kind of document that we have that allows us access to things that we don't normally have access to do. The Japanese passport apparently is the most coveted passport. I was just reading on the news because it allows you access to the most countries. And I don't know how they rate that every year, but the Japanese passport is here. 42% of Americans have passports, which is really important. In 1990, it was about 4%. So a lot of Americans are getting passports, which is great. And I don't think it's just because people want to go to Canada where you need a passport now, right? There used to be a time and a day where the passport stamps that you get in your passport were bragging rights. And maybe if you're, maybe at a time when we needed more visas to travel, there was a time when you needed more visas to travel to countries than today. A lot of countries today, for Americans, you don't need a visa. But you still need a stamp. So this idea of having these stamps and sharing where you've been around the world, having to get more pages added to your passport. Anybody ever had to have more pages added to their passport because they've just been traveling so much, right? I mean, that's pretty cool and something you can show people. When I left Hartford Community College in 2005, a colleague of mine gave this to me. And I keep it in my office to remind me how important travel is. Travel is certainly a metaphor for other ways that we learn about the world. It isn't through travel necessarily. But traveling is an important aspect of it. So whether it be study abroad, whether you're doing traveling with your family for pleasure or in other ways, we all know that travel is the best way of learning about other people at times, right? That is, engaging and being in uncomfortable situations and having to order off of a dinner menu when you don't know the language, or asking for directions, or just that sense of isolation, or maybe that sense of connectedness, right? Trying to navigate something that is new to you and you don't have the right app today or the right guidebook, so you're figuring, no, I'm just going to have to wing it. The challenge of trying to communicate with somebody when you don't have the language but you're using hand signals in very creative ways. All that is a really important learning aspect that people get through travel abroad. This is a photograph from the Tenement Museum in New York City. Anybody been to the Tenement Museum in New York City? So you're standing up because you've been to the Tenement Museum in New York City? Yes. Yes. Fabulous museum. Great learning experience. And one of the things that it reminded me of the fact is that we are all immigrants. Unless we come from Native American stock, and even Native American people got here long before we did, we've all come here. Some of our stories have been heartbreaking stories because we've come in bondage, or we've come because of oppression. In many, many different ways we've come here. We're all immigrants. This is John and Caroline Snyder's German beer lager, their saloon on Orchard Street in Manhattan, in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And one of the things when you go to the Tenement Museum, you take these specific tours in this area, and sometimes you're going into buildings, sometimes you're going into particular rooms or scenarios. There are actors that will reenact the circumstances. And actually, you're walking through the buildings that were there when people were living there. In other words, it's not like they recreated. This was a tenement house. And this is actually where their saloon was. And what struck me was, in remembering, and I've got some German heritage, my wife has much more, is that when Germans came to the United States, predominantly in the 19th century, they came here because they were actually fleeing oppression and the revolutions in the mid-19th century in Germany. Germany was not a unified country until Bismarck, so there were fights between groups. There was often, Germany had a history of religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics and Jews, who were also in Germany. But when they came to the United States, they all realized that there was a German identity that they could connect with each other. And so places like this, people could sit down together, and whether they were German, Jewish, German Catholic, German Protestant, it didn't really make any difference. The Schneiders actually, I think the father was from, John Schneider was from Prussia, and I think his wife was from Bavaria, or maybe it was the other way around. I think but they were from different parts of Germany that competed with each other, but they were together here. So, you know, the American story of immigrants coming together and often finding their identity here and working together, and those of you who are from German ancestry know that, you know, Germans have played a significant role in American society when it comes to advancing kind of labor organizations in particular, education and so forth. Often it started in a saloon where people could get together. So, as is my nature, when I give talks, I want to get you thinking about certain things and getting the audience to be considering certain concepts. And I have my own definition, if you will, of what global learning is. And I will share with you, and we're going to go through kind of examples of how that works. But I really want to spend some time really asking you for a minute to think about what global learning is and sharing with a partner. So I'm going to ask you just to sit with a partner or sit in a triad, that's fine also. We're just going to take 3 minutes on this. We're not going to say, and I just want you to talk about to you what global learning is. And that means it's going to mean some moving. And if I see people are not moving, I'm going to extend it and start suggesting, just talk to the person next to you. We are educators, right? And education is part of what we do, and this is what we would do with our students. If we want to model it ourselves, I think that's important. So just sit and talk to somebody for a few minutes and share what your notion of global learning is. All right, I'm going to have you come back together if we can. So, this is one of the challenges when you get faculty talking about education and learning, you can't really stop them, right? So, I don't know, I don't have a handheld, but if people have large outside voices, if somebody wants to share with me, maybe a couple people sharing how they perceive global learning or global education, talking about what a definition would be or how they look at it. Would somebody like to volunteer? Yes. Use your outside voice. Tell me who you are and where you're from also.
I see global learning as meeting for us. We're all creating the same, and we all need to get along. But I don't feel like we need to go really far to meet. We actually, in Orlando, we do a missionary trip every fall, and we're in the Appalachians, and we take senior students with us, and it's very rewarding because we come back feeling guilty for what we take for granted. We take so much for granted from people that don't have that access. So I think it's important for us to be humble, to be understanding, and not to assume things just because of our interpretation or our deficits or our biases.
So, thank you so much. Thank you. And kudos to Anne Arundel for doing that. That's really great. Somebody else would like to share what global learning is to them and using an example or how they would define it. This is a global learning conference, so I know we've all been thinking about it. Yes, if you could stand up, identify who you are. Okay? Can everybody hear?
All right, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. My name is Frank Seidel. I'm a computer science professor at Frederick Community College. And one of the things to add to what you were saying is I teach computer science. We really don't travel as part of the program. But what I do is cover things like Unicode. If you know about the unified coding scheme of languages all over the world, that's available in Java programming, and I spend time going through all sorts of different languages that are available through this coding scheme. I also talk about how, for example, object-oriented programming was developed in 3 different parts of the world around the same time. And the language used in those different parts of the world in terms of describing objects is slightly different, but it's very connected.
Wow.
So we don't have to travel to have a global aspect to what we do.
Excellent. Thank you, Frank. One more. Someone could.
Right,
You're right place at the right time.
I was just walking down actually to hear everything better. I completely missed the first one and caught the tail end of this one, but I would say, you know, global learning, global education is understanding, I think it's tagging on to what you were saying, just our interconnectedness, that there's no aspect of our lives as humans that is, you know, we can ever consider disconnected from the rest of the world, and learning how to step outside of our own norms and, you know, our own way of our ethnocentrism, I guess, which is often unconscious in a lot of us, and learning to see things from another perspective is really important. And one example I love is taken from, how many of you have seen My Great Big Greek Wedding? Okay, good, there are a few people. Well, there's this one scene where you have this, you know, in this big Greek family, and, you know, their daughter is marrying somebody who is not Greek at all, and so one of the cultural things that they confront is the concept of spitting, which in the Greek culture is giving a blessing. It's a good thing. It's very positive and very much a part of their lives. And you look at the parents of the son who at the wedding are absolutely appalled because everybody's spitting at the bride walking down. And as Americans, it's completely different. So, so I think understanding that we all, you know, given our different cultures, we're going to see things differently, but looking for the commonalities and understanding our interconnectedness. And I think I'd love to hear more on conflict resolution, because I think that's so important in the world today. But I think that's an important part of our global learning, is how to deal with the conflicts that are rampant in our world today. So unexpectedly talking, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do one more. One more. Anybody else? One more. Tell me what global learning is to you. How about somebody from over here? You guys are awfully part of the globe? All right, well, let's go on then. Think about it, and think about what people have said as being examples to them of what global learning is. You know, there's no universal definition. It's how we interpret it. But it's always about engaging our students in new experiences. For me, talking about my definition, when I think about education, I generally start here, and I start with John Dewey. For me, the Vermont Yankee John Dewey, educational reformer, who really believed that experience is so critical to learning, is really what I've always taken to heart. Even though we learn in many different ways, this idea of learning from experience, particularly reflecting on experience, is to me is a very, very powerful means. If I asked you about your own college experiences and asking you what was the most meaningful, you might cite a professor and you might cite something that you learned, but it's more likely you're going to remember a specific situation you were in. Maybe an internship or a trip or a project you were involved in. That's very experiential. And then I think about Maria Montessori, the Italian physician, who really argued that the structure is not really that important at times. It's really up to us, and it's in all of our experiences to learn. So giving students, giving young people in particular, the opportunity to learn at their own pace in their own ways. That learning doesn't stop when the classroom ends, right? It's something that we do continuously. So the idea that learning best takes place through experience and occurs naturally has always been something that's important to me. So when I think about global learning as a result, I think about learning, and to me, learning equals engagement. And I know we can learn in many different ways, but ultimately the most important learning that's been impactful to me is when I'm engaged in things, when I've done things, when I've had experiences. Engagement maybe is broader than that idea. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're looking at, because we started looking at the globe, and I want to talk about global issues, and I want to talk about how community colleges are responding to some of those. So some of you are probably familiar with the World Economic Forum. It was founded in 1971 in Geneva, and it meets every January in Davos. And Davos, all of these leaders come together, business leaders come together, and talk about the issues that are important to the world. And political leaders go there, business leaders go there. One of the things that they've done, the World Economic Forum, is set up something called the Shapers. The Shapers are millennials, maybe not so much millennials, maybe now we're into Generation X, but they're under 30, who are people who are kind of making change, and they're nominated and they're selected, right? And then they play this role in this group in trying to assist the World Economic Forum in figuring out what are the things that we should all be working on. So in 2017, the Shapers actually implemented a survey. And the survey went to 31,000 people around the world from 186 countries. And the final answers, analysis presented report, are based on answers of 24,000 or 25,000 surveys. And you can see the countries that responded. This is important because often we think about, well, there's a Western bias or a US bias, and so we have to kind of dig a little bit deeper and see people responding from. And you see Germany, Mexico, of course the US, El Salvador. These are the countries that the response came from. So there were 10 issues that they put out there, and then they were ranked as to which of those 10 issues are the most important ones. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through those 10 issues, and I'm going to start with the one that was ranked the least, the less number of people that said it was number one, to the number that the most people said was number one. And then talk about what community colleges are doing to respond to that. So you think about global issues and challenges we're dealing with, and how then we're responding to it as a community college institutional world, we'll say. So this is important. Only 12% in that survey in 2017, it might be higher today, said lack of economic opportunity and unemployment is an important issue that we should be focusing on. And one of the things that in community colleges I think we recognize, or maybe we're not always cognizant of it, is that in a way, almost the raison d'etre of community colleges have been to offer economic opportunities to our students, right? This was a study that was done through the Rockefeller Foundation, and it really talked about what community colleges are doing to kind of raise the level of students and economic opportunity what they can do. One of the programs they cited here, anybody here from Prince George's, I'm sure? The middle college program at Prince George's Community College as being really a real model of raising economic opportunity for community college students. So this is something that we talk about, possibly, maybe we don't recognize we're talking about it all the time in a direct way, but this is really important. Safety, security, and well-being. So 14% of the participants in the survey said this is the most important one. Now, safety, security, well-being are somewhat related to each other. It really deals with feeling safe and secure where you are, right? Might relate to health. It might relate to human rights. It might relate to physical safety. So there are many different ways of interpreting this. But one community college that I've worked with that is doing something really unique is Johnson County Community College, which is in Overland Park, Kansas. In 2012, they received a very, very small seed grant from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I wasn't there at the time when they received the grant, but they received this grant. And with that grant, they've developed a partnership in the greater Kansas City area with Park University, a couple other institutions, to run an annual conference on peace building. Now, we're not talking about peace building necessarily, but the issues that you deal with regard to peace often deal with safety and security. And last year's talk was about human rights. Human rights is a matter of safety and security around the world, and community colleges are addressing it. And they're addressing it here. I know a number of community colleges that have courses in human rights. And certainly human rights is something that's talked about everywhere in sociology and psychology and political science. This is the freedom map of the world in 2019 from Freedom House. And sometimes we're not cognizant of what the rest of the world looks like. We live in a society where, for the most part, we are free to give our opinions. We're free from arbitrary arrests and things of that nature. But you can see much of the world is not in that circumstance. And many of the students that we see in our classroom are coming from places where there isn't that much freedom. And they come to America, and now they're experiencing something they've never experienced before. I'm sure you all have a story of talking to a student who has just arrived into your classroom, and they're talking about what they've experienced, and they're shocked maybe about what they're seeing here or what they're not seeing here. The fact that you can actually call the police in the United States and dial 911 and 311, and they will show up, right? And they're not showing up to arrest you. And they're not, many countries of the world, to call the police, citizens don't do that because they're afraid of calling the police, because if they're calling the police, they're causing a problem, and then they may be targeted, right? Or there is no police protection for that matter, right? Or there's no respect of people's privacy or their rights. Lack of education. So this is an issue that, of course, that we're all involved in education. And one of the things, my daughter is an early childhood education major at Towson University, and I've learned a lot about early childhood education that I never knew before. And one of the things is community colleges are at the front line of early childhood education. The majority of early childhood education programs in the United States are in community colleges. 2/3 of community colleges have early childhood education programs. And if you've been following politics and you've been following what we're looking at education in Maryland, we're going to be funding more early childhood education in Maryland. It's a national priority. Many of the candidates who are running for president are talking about early childhood education, and we are there. We are doing this work, right? How many people here are involved in education, early childhood or K through 12 education, right? I mean, a lot of attention is now going to be placed on community colleges and what they can do here. Food and water security. So, once again, we live in a society where worrying about food and water security might not be something that is a high priority for us. I'm reminded when I go out west how expensive people's water bills are. Our water bills in the East are not as expensive as they are out West, right? And so water is more expensive, but we can still afford it. But many parts of the world, there are dire shortages of water, right? In fact, they're saying in the future, water is going to be the new gold, fresh water, right? And if you think about water in terms of climate change and dryness and aridness, then immediately comes to mind is what's going on in Australia right now. So food security, in particular, is something that we can bring a sensitivity to our students to understand about food security, in many respects how lucky we are as Americans, but also in recognizing how much we waste as Americans. There's been a lot out there about the amount of food that restaurants waste, the amount of food that households waste. This is from St. Philip's College, which is actually a community college in the Alamo Colleges district, and they're running an Oxfam hunger banquet. Oxfam is a British NGO, and since 1974, they have sponsored hunger banquets. And hunger banquet, has anybody here ever participated in a hunger banquet at their community college? It's very moving, or done anywhere, a hunger banquet. It's a very moving experience because students are getting tickets, and they have to trade their tickets to get food, and some students got nothing, and some students have everything. So they understand the need of at least in the simulation, deprivation of what they don't have and how they have to get more in order to survive. So it's a really positive learning experience if you haven't done it with your students. Governance, accountability, transparency, corruption. Once again, these are all kind of brought together for purposes of the survey. So one of the ways of understanding it is just this notion of good, say democracy, we'll say, right? Representative government, right? Understanding civics, right? Being accountable to constituencies. This is Community Colleges for Democracy, which is now part of Campus Compact, but until a year ago, it was called the Democracy Commitment. Is anybody ever familiar with the Democracy Commitment? Anybody here from Allegheny College in Maryland? There's a chapter of the Democracy Commitments involved in here. The Democracy Commitment, which was the predecessor of this organization, which is now part of Campus Compact, really was a consortium of about 50 to 60 community colleges around the US that focus on democracy education with their students and really advancing learning about civics, learning about society, learning about voting as really important part of community college work. I mean, we've gone through a period in America where we've really emphasized STEM education, which is very important. Unfortunately, to some extent, we've neglected social science education, particularly democracy education. So groups like now Community Colleges for Democracy are trying to change that. This is from Transparency International, which is an NGO that looks at, based in Berlin, that looks at corruption levels around the world. And the darker the color, the more corruption. So once again, many of your students are coming from environments where bribery, corruption, extortion, those kind of things are things that they've experienced that they may not be experiencing here. CCI, Community College Initiative, is a State Department program that's now in its 10th year. And it's a grant that the State Department gives through Education and Cultural Affairs to community colleges to bring international students to their campuses for a year. And the grant that I've worked with is the one that Northern Virginia Community College has held for many years, which consists of a consortium of about 5 or 6 different community colleges, including Nova. Nova brings about 40 students to their campus, and the other community colleges do the same. Students stay for a year. They come in July, they leave in June or somewhere around there. And one of the things that's interesting is that students, of course, they've never been to the United States. They're coming to the United States and they're living together in dormitory style housing. I think Nova goes and rents apartments for them. Students are from Indonesia and from Kenya and from Pakistan and from Thailand and from all over the world. But what I often do, this is a program that I ran with students and met with them, and I do this on an annual basis, and we were talking about issues that are facing their country. I'm surprised how many students are saying corruption is a major issue in their country. I remember in 2012, at the beginning of this grant, I did a presentation with a larger group of students in CCI, And I was just amazed how many students were saying, yes, we have literacy problems, we have this, we have that, but the big problem is corruption. And if we can get rid of the corruption in our country, right, then we can do other things because the money's being siphoned out for things they don't need. And these are young people, of course, making this argument. This is about the program at ECA, Education and Cultural Affairs. Religious conflict. So 24% in the Global Shaper survey said religious conflict is the most important issue. And we have polarization in this country, often along political and religious lines, but we don't have conflict in this country, I think, at least violent conflict that we see in other parts of the world, right? That divide between different religious sects. Even within religious communities, you see a lot of violent conflict, right? And we're not here to kind of cast blame or kind of understand it as much to recognize that people think this is something that's important for them to deal with. So community colleges around the United States often are looking at this in a global context, but also could be looking at this in a more localized context. Valencia College, which is a community college that serves Orlando, has a Peace and Justice Institute. Their Peace and Justice Institute is now, I think, in the 6th or 7th year. They have a separate board that runs it. They are funded by the college. They run an interfaith series where they bring people of different faiths together, and they're serving the entire Orlando community. I think there are 5 or 6 campuses of Valencia College in talking about different issues and the divides between them. One of the real remarkable programs that Orlando has, and I think if I had more time I'd show this video, is something called Orlando Speaks. So sponsored by Valencia College. This is not so much about religious exchange as about dialogue between police and the community. So they run these on, I think, a monthly basis where they bring members of the Orlando community and law enforcement together to talk about issues related to community relations between law enforcement and the community. And they do this throughout the Orlando area. Poverty. So poverty, once again, in the United States, maybe not so much of an issue, or at least we don't see it as an issue, even though it is. It's still an issue around the world. Even though I must tell you, it is one thing that we have made gains on in the eradication of poverty over the course of the last 40 years. But we're still not quite there yet. So how many campuses, how many community colleges here have food pantries? Now, it looks like you all have food pantries, right? The College and University Food Board Alliance says there are about 650 colleges around the United States that have food pantries. I think it's much larger than that, right? And you're having a food pantry because you're not doing it because, well, we just got this space that we're going to use. You're doing it because you're recognizing a need with your students. They're not eating properly. Sometimes that's the issue, right? So providing them balanced meals, or they can't afford to buy food because they're doing other things, raising their family, supporting their parents, supporting their kids, and so forth. And you know that hunger has an effect on learning, right? If students come in the classroom and they're hungry, they're not going to be learning, right? So if we can provide a space for them to be able to get the things that they need to take them home is important. This is an important, here it is, College and University Food Bank Alliance, 570, they're saying. I think I checked, it's larger now. I would say that the number of people in extreme poverty has dropped. So this is what it's expected. This is internationally. It's been dropping, but it's still an issue. And it often looks different in different places, right? I think the abject, hungry kind of image of the skeletal young child, which is kind of you see in kind of photographs and so forth, is not what you see in the United States, as much as you see poor nutritional choices being made in the United States that affect then lifespan and health issues. So it's still a food poverty issue, but it just manifests itself differently. But we're doing something about it, right? Food pantries is a way of doing it. Inequality. So 31% felt that inequality was the big issue. And just like economic opportunity, this is something that, for the most part, community colleges recognize as part of their mission, right? if you think about what we're trying to do in community colleges, particularly when we have students who are first-generation college or have recently arrived because they're recent immigrants, what we're really trying to do is provide them with opportunities that provide equality between them and other people in society. And it's not just not economic equality, it's political equality, right? It's equality in the workplace that we're trying to advocate for also. Lots of times what we're looking at in the classroom is how do we guarantee parity between men and women, between people who are white and black and of other groups also, so that everyone has a chance, everyone is working from the same level. This becomes really important. But inequality in this country is going up, right? And I know that this is an argument that some of the Democratic presidential candidates have been making, but the statistics are really showing that the top earners continue to pull away from everyone else. And when that happens, you're seeing the gap between the rich and the poor continue in the United States. And the poor are our students, or not as affluent are our students. So this is going to be something that we're going to continue to have to work on. Large-scale conflict and war. So people in the survey also, once again, we're looking at it globally, and if you remember the list of countries that from the beginning, many of these countries are actually countries that are in conflict around the world. So for them, it's a very powerful thing to see. I think the fourth or fifth responding country on this was El Salvador. And El Salvador has been in a perpetual state of conflict, even though it's been more low level, it's based on gang violence and high levels of violence. Here, different things are going on in community colleges. So one of the things, some of the things that I'm doing, is that for the last 7 years, I run a community college seminar at George Mason for community college faculty looking at conflict and peace building. This is actually from a seminar, I think, 2 years ago, where we visited the State Department, connecting community college faculty with policymakers so that they know what's going on and even can offer some of their own input. This is a simulation that my NGO runs, teaching community college students, among other groups, what it's like to be a humanitarian worker. So when we talk about large-scale conflict and war, we're also talking about what we would say are the aftermath or the effects of it, right? What happens when you have war and conflict? You have refugees, you have displaced people, you have people in need. These are actually Allegheny College of Maryland students who are role players in the simulation that we run in Western Maryland. This is kind of interesting. This is actually the College of Southern Idaho, and this is a refugee center that they run. So a lot of refugees come to the United States coming as a result of conflict and violence. So this is a community college that has a refugee center that serves refugees in the Idaho area. And then curriculum-wise, community colleges are doing things like Cuyahoga Community College, which has a conflict and peace studies certificate. This is a book on peace building that I authored several years ago. Or Golden West College, it has a degree, an associate's degree in peace studies. In getting students to understand about the conflict and violence around the world, and getting them to think about action steps that they can take. There are probably about 40, I'd say probably between 35 and 40 community colleges in the United States and Canada that have peace and conflict studies programs that are looking at big issues of war and violence and how to respond to it. And then the last, what we would expect, is climate change. So in 2017, in fact, we don't even use the word climate change anymore. What do we call it? Climate crisis, right? The wording has changed. 49% said this is priority number one. This is a news briefing from West Los Angeles Area Community College, or West Los Angeles Community College, who just started an environmental studies degree program, the first in California, and this came out about 3 weeks ago, right? I'm sure a number of community colleges here are involved in environmental studies, either as part of another program, but have environmental studies programs. One of my favorite is at Bristol Community College. Nancy Lee Wood runs this program, and it's a sustainability studies program. And she focuses actually on water issues and dealing with water and getting students to understand that and helping them advance careers in sustainability. So a lot of our issues with regard to climate change, realizing that the big blue marbles in trouble our consciousness has been raised by a 14-year-old, right? And I can't get the quote correctly, but the children will lead the adults or something of that nature. And I think that's what's happened in many respects, that as adults, we get stuck, we don't recognize the options that we have, and sometimes the children are in a better position to understand where we should be going. And I'm hoping that what we see with regard to this climate crisis is that how can community colleges then step up themselves in the various programs that we have now that we can build from, and looking at solving this important problem. So let's talk for a few minutes, ending up and looking at some of the future challenges that we have. So this was from 2017, and these challenges are not going to go away. Climate change, global war, poverty, inequality are not going to go away. But as we move forward, we're dealing with other global challenges. One is the challenge of aging and how we respond to that. And how do we respond to that as a workforce? How do we respond to that from a global health standpoint? How do we respond to that from many, many different ways, right? I was in New York City visiting a tenement museum, and on the I guess it's near the bus stops, they have these movable, changing billboards. And one of the billboards was 71%, I remember 71%, of immigrants in New York City are working in healthcare and with aged populations, right? That's like where they are working. So if you're hiring a healthcare worker to come and support your parents, be there for them, the chances are they're a recent immigrant, right? And to get that understanding of what that needs to be a healthcare worker, where are those recent immigrants going to school? Where should they be going to school? In community college. This is mass migration. This is in Bangladesh. People moving into Cox's Bazar, which is the massive refugee camp there. But people are on the move, and that's going to continue. There are 71 million displaced people around the world. The highest number, well, it's the highest number ever. There weren't even that number after World War I, right? Displaced people are either internally displaced, refugees, or asylum seekers. And we used to say, well, people were displaced because of war and violence. That's changing. People are displaced because of climate change, right? Because of fires in Australia and Northern California, right? Because of another earthquake, or an earthquake in Puerto Rico that no one seems to be reporting about, because we've got so many other things that need to get our attention, right? People are saying in Puerto Rico that the earthquake was more serious than Maria, but no one's talking about the earthquake. So as our society changes or affected by climate, we're going to have more and more people on the move. How are we going to respond to that as community colleges? Promise and challenge of the age of artificial intelligence, right? So broadly in terms of technology, artificial intelligence is part of that. In my house, even though I'm not so sure I should be doing it all the time, I could ask a question of my kids or my wife or whoever, my in-laws, but I could say, hey, Google, and someone answers me, right? How can I help you? I don't know what hey Google says, I don't remember, but I can get an answer there, right? So how are we as community colleges responding not only to the opportunity of that, but the challenge of that also, when it comes to issues of privacy, when it comes to issues of equity, when it comes to issues of how to use it in an ethical way. And this is something also we've been talking a lot about lately, is mental health. And it's not just a problem in the United States, it's a global problem, right? We see the stress of our young people. I see it in my own children. Stress levels that I don't remember ever experiencing when I was in college or when I was in high school. And the stress, we could point fingers at different places. We can go to social media, or we can go to, overcrowdedness or competitiveness or whatever it is. But we have to deal with it somehow, and maybe if we can't get to the source of it, at least we can at least manage it somehow and make it an issue and a priority. All of you are seeing stress among your students that probably you have not seen before. How then, as a community college community, do we respond to that and deal with that? So I'm just gonna have you think about this because we're about running out of time. And I have one more slide after this, is I just want you to think about for a moment one personal commitment you will make in the next year, one professional objective you will try to reach, and we're not going to share with partner. But I want you to think about this because I can get up here and I can raise these ideas and concepts with you, but if you're not really taking away something that you're going to do from it, I just as soon have not come today. It's really important for you to think about where do you go with this. Where do you go with this personally? You can take it from this list here and think about something what you should be doing yourself, or you can think about some other issue that you should be dealing with. And think not only from a personal standpoint, think about it from a standpoint of what you should be doing with your students. Is there something you should be doing with your students? And these problems, though some of them have particular contexts like religious conflict, and you say, well, I would only talk about that in a social science course. No, you can talk about these issues in any course. You could be teaching IT or nursing or whatever and raise some of these issues. So I really would want you to make a commitment. I want just to make a comment about the state of international and global education. And one of the things that I think is going on in this country, and it may be deal with it in a political context in some respects, is that colleges are emphasizing it less. At least this is what data is showing from the American International Education Administrators, that it's not as high a strategic priority. Now, that might mean that it's really being incorporated, that we don't have to talk about it as much. Or it might mean there are other things that are pushing it off the list. And there are other things that are becoming more important than this. And this is something we need to reflect on, is that if what we're saying is global learning is really important to our students, but it doesn't become a college priority, what does that say? Conversely, we have a high number of international students. This is IIE from last year coming to the United States. There was a dip for a number of years, and now the numbers have been going up. A lot of community colleges have international students that are coming back. So this is just something to think about. I don't really have an answer here because there seems to be some contradiction that's going on. But I want to leave with this. So many years ago, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine at USIP, U.S. Institute of Peace, and we were talking about learning and global education and so forth. And she's Canadian. So I asked her, I said, well, how is global education taught in Canada? Because I was really interested in seeing what other models are like in other places. And she thought. And this is what she said to me. And this is something that we really need to kind of focus on a bit here, is that if we continue to treat global education as something else that is along the list of things that we check off or the things that we put in our strategic plan, it's always going to be vulnerable. And it's also being said as something apart that makes it sometimes politically risky and vulnerable, financially vulnerable. And shouldn't the attitude be that global education is really what education is about? And strive to integrate completely into what we do things that are global to the sense that it's indistinguishable. That the examples that we're using and the things that we're talking in our classroom, it's not a matter of this is global and this is not, but everything is really global and everything is really education. Thank you very much. So I don't know, do we have time for questions, George? I don't know where we are.
Yes, we do.
We have a few questions, so if people have questions, thoughts, provocative and otherwise, pushbacks, that's good too. I take everything. Their own reflections of things that they're doing that they want to share. Please, now's the time to do it. Yes, please. And we have a microphone. Yes, thank you.
I was talking to the English department about our English as second language students because I give them a lot of credit because if I was in their country, I would not be doing as well. I do work in the nursing department, and it was something that came up. We had a student that was really struggling because of the transitioning the test questions into her language to be able to answer it, and then to be able to answer it, she went for accommodations and was denied. Because they do not do accommodations just for the language issue.
Interesting.
So I brought that up to our chair, and I told him that that really doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and they really need to look into it. And they were not aware of it in the English department, that that was a denial with DDS. So
Interesting.
I'm hoping it changes.
Okay. Well, if other people have similar experiences, they should ask you. Yes.
I was going to say that at our school, I won't tell you what school it is, we get around that problem by saying you tell them that you're having anxiety during the test.
That's what I told the student. I said, don't even talk about the language. Say that you're stressed out.
Workarounds are what community college faculty do, right? Any other reflections, thoughts? So I've got some materials up here talking a little bit about what community colleges are doing. You're welcome to pick it up. I will be around here the rest of the day. The next session that I'm going to be involved in is a Fulbright panel. We had a Fulbright panel yesterday. We have a Fulbright panel again today of different Fulbrighters who are going to be talking at the beginning of next session, so please join us. So thank you again.
It's been our pleasure to have David Smith speak with you all, and he won't go away empty-handed. He'll get the AFACCT mug for this year.
I have a collection, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Please give me a hand. The next session that you have is rather nice. It's lunch. And lunch is from 11:35 to 12:35. And then the next session from 12:45 to 1:45 will be session number 6, which will be the Fulbright people.